So let's start with the first panel. The first panel for today is activism in academia, or academia and activism, or academia in activism, whichever way you want to take it. And we have three contributions today on this panel. The first contribution or paper is going to be presented by four students from the University of Oxford. Anna Alekseyeva, Elodie Negar Behzadi, Anna Davidson, and Kelsi Nagy. And the title of the paper is Challenges to Political Expression in a Changing Academic Landscape, a Personal View. Then the second contribution is going to be presented by Torsten Gehlen, University of Cambridge. And then the title of the paper or the contribution is The Struggle for Economic Pluralism, Disobedient Theory and Disobedient Students. And the third paper contribution, titled Helpless Onlookers or Potential Game Changers, how can we respond to increasing inequality and hierarchy in and beyond the academia, is going to be presented by Michael O'Donnell from the University of Westminster.
My name is Kelsi Nagy. I'm from the University of Oxford, and I will start off the introduction for our panel, which is Challenges to Political Expression in a Changing Academic Landscape, a Personal View. So I'd like my colleagues to introduce themselves.
I'm Anna Davidson, studying geography.
Elodie, Negar, Behzadi, studying geography.
And Alekseyeva, also studying geography.
So to introduce this paper, we felt that it was important to put our topic into a context. We are looking at the depoliticization of the social sciences, our department's discouraging work that is viewed as overtly political. How do people that view their work as political navigate changes in department administration and funding? And if funding is becoming more neoliberalized and departments are becoming more neoliberalized, now that funding is becoming less public and more privatized, how is this affecting the kind of research that is being funded and how it is being conducted? And we're also looking at and hoping that our research brings out this kind of appearance of diversity within geography departments. And we are aware that in important ways, geography faculty and researchers are more diverse and speak for more marginalized voices. But we're curious to know if these changes only give the appearance of change, or if they are allowing voices of marginalized groups to really challenge oppressive institutions and paradigms in impactful ways. For example, does the publish or perish mentality limit academics to speak only to other academics and not to groups or activists that might benefit the most from their research? So why are we conducting this research? We're interested in how academics within geography departments in the United Kingdom at different stages of their careers experience political activism within these contexts. And we're interested in knowing how they negotiate these multiple changes to find spaces of expression and commitment. So a lot of our interviewees expressed the ways that they bring out their activism even though they have certain constraints. For our methods and methodologies, we interviewed 6 people, 2 men and 4 women. The ages ranged between the late 30s and late 50s. We had one early third-year postdoc, so an early career academic. That was very early in her career. We had a 9-year career academic, and then we had 3 mid-career academics that have been in academia between 23 and 29 years, and 1 late career academic that was at 36 years in academia. The majority of the people we interviewed were human geographers or social geographers, and we only had 1 physical geographer represented in our sample group. We felt that it was important to kind of challenge current paradigms in presenting conference papers for social geographers by collaborating. And so it was a conscious choice to work together and pull our research together and present together. And for us, this presentation is as personal as it is an academic project, because we were using these interviews to help us look towards the future for our potential academic careers, and also how we might position our research, because we all consider our research as political. So on that note, we have three main themes that we'll be presenting on. We're going to question our participants if they felt that there was an ivory tower mentality, and if that was being changed in this kind of neoliberalization of universities. And we looked at different tactics of negotiation and resistance that they employed, and then how they position themselves, their reflexivity and their collegiality within their academic and activist work.
The interviewees were very often mentioning the idea that academics were perceived as living in a kind of ivory tower, and that there was a necessity really to challenge this idea, because academics were actually really impacted by the neoliberal shift. So most interviewees really try to emphasize the hardships and the difficulties of navigating through this context of neoliberalism. And so we kind of try to synthesize the different themes that came out of the interviews. So one of them was the casualization of labor, with the idea of increasing zero-hour contracts, short-term contracts, the necessary mobility of postdocs and young academics as well as older academics. That can be seen as a constraint and is not only positive. So the second point was the publish or perish mentality, with an increasing pressure to publish in specific journals, which specifically impact younger academics. And that is actually often contradictory with the objectives in terms of political expression and commitment, in the sense that journals were often described as places where it was difficult to express radical political opinions because of the peer review system, but also because of the journal panels and editorial panels and committees that were not always very open to very radical ideas. So the third issue that was really emphasized was the issue of the pressure in terms of funding. And it was very interesting for us to see that the one physical geographer we interviewed is the only person who mentioned the fact that they had more funding on the physical geography side. Most social human geographers were emphasizing the fact that funding was reduced, and that funding also, they self-funded more and more their work, and that this was really impacting the quality of their work, the depth of the research, the level of engagement with the field. So this echoed in a way the idea that was also mentioned during the interviews, that non-fungible research is less and less funded, and there is a tendency to refuse, well, that there is less funding available for more theoretical and political ideas that remain in the field of theory, and try to transform discourses. The fourth theme that came out was the idea of the managerialism of the university and the transformation of the administration context, with more and more administrative positions being filled by people who were not coming from the academic field. And this was really threatening the understanding of what academia meant and what political activism meant, in the sense that administrative who came from the private sector didn't have really this commitment to sharing political ideas and to political commitment. And this was leading to a kind of individualism within departments, within geography departments, and a lack of collegiality and difficulty to work together, to be politically active together. So the idea that people are politically active on their side with their own research, but a lack of possibility to work together to express political ideas. And finally, what we found interesting and felt very concerned about that was the idea of the destruction of the role of the academics, with the two sides, one side research side and one teaching side, with the creation of more and more positions that were only teaching position or research position, especially for young academics. And most interviewees were expressing the fact that they considered the teaching as inherently political, and that the fact that that was this dichotomy between the two now and the separation was really threatening the position and the role of academics and the role of academics to shape new ideas and a new way of thinking amongst younger students. So in a way, so all the ideas that came out of these interviews were that we are clearly not in an ivory tower, and that academics are very impacted by the neoliberal shift. But what we found very interesting during these interviews also was the more subtle way, maybe, that neoliberalism was kind of impacting the interviewees and the academics, in the sense that there was neoliberalism seems to discipline academics and constrain their political expression and commitment through the creation and constitution of neoliberal values and the integration of these values into the way we work. So the image, the actual image of Foucault's panopticon has been used in one of our interviews actually to show how these norms were ingrained in people's behavior and that people were kind of self-disciplining themselves. And one example is the publishing, the pressure on publications. The idea that nobody's really looking at what you're doing, well, in certain universities, probably more than others, but there is still a kind of flexibility regarding the level of publications in some universities. But people were feeling the need and the necessity to publish because this is what is expected from an academics to publish a lot in journals these days. It was interesting to see how younger academics were speaking about success and failure, with the idea of success being associated to a kind of idealized version of an academics that was really internalizing the neoliberal values with the idea of being self-enterprising, innovative, dynamic, someone who publishes a lot. And so not being in this position of success makes you feel like you're failing into your academic career, whilst the people we interviewed were all in position, had all a position actually, so were kind of successful in their academic career in some sense. So the last part that really reflected this kind of disciplining and the creation of the neoliberal subject was the idea that there is a generation that was identified as a kind of co-opted generation that doesn't even question the neoliberalization of academia and doesn't really want to be committed and rebel against the system. And one example that was given was the fact that people were not interested, for instance, in traditional ways of resisting. The unions and the integration in unions, for instance, were identified as traditional ways of resisting. And because the idea of being a rebel is and politically active is something that is perceived as negative and that is completely contradictory with the idea of being innovating, being dynamic, and is usually associated with the protection of old values and old system that is contradictory with the idea of these neoliberal values. So we're going to continue with theme 2 now.
So to follow de Certeau, who wrote about sort of tactics of resistance in the everyday, where these tactics are both made possible by these very disciplinary mechanisms, but also serve to sort of outlive them and subvert them. We found that from our respondents there was, we could sort of follow Jane Wills's way of categorizing 3 different forms of engagement. Jane Wills, I saw some like. So Jane Wills is actually here at Queen Mary. She's in the geography department, and she recently she sent me a chapter that will be published soon in the Sage Handbook of Human Geography. And she makes 3 distinctions between ways in which human geographers can engage politically. The first is didactic, then it's epistemological, and then ontological. And we found that was quite well reflected in the interviews that we had too. So to start with, and it's worth pointing out too that the 3 aren't sort of 3 separate ones. They always sort of intermingle, and one academic will represent many of those 3 different, hopefully, those 3 different ways of engaging. So from the didactic perspective, I mean, that's really seeing it as applying your knowledge or your research to the world, or disseminating your research. So the physical geographer we spoke to mentioned this in terms of, communicating my results. So it's a very sort of physical geography way of doing it. But it was mentioned in terms of teaching, publishing tactics, speaking opportunities, and outreach. So for publishing strategies, to sort of subvert this need to publish in, high quality journals, there was some people mentioned, the people who were able to do this as a tactic, mentioned focusing on publishing books and creating movies. So movies as a way to, videos as a way to engage more broadly outside of academia, and books as a way to engage students and academics, because apparently academics don't really read journals anymore, as sort of one of the interviews said. Others mentioned blogs as a way to reach wider audiences. And in terms of teaching strategies, for some people, for some of the respondents, actually teaching was one of their main kind of political activisms. So through teaching and to teach students to think critically, that was what they considered to be their main contribution and the reason they went into academia. And with that also goes a sort of language choice. So by choosing, some of these academics choosing not to publish only in academic journals, but to publish more widely, they were able to employ a kind of language that was more accessible and open. When it came to the epistemological engagement, so with with epistemological engagement, what I mean and what I think Jane Wills means is that you're engaging with the outside world, if we want to make this crude distinction, in order to kind of produce your knowledge itself. So by critically engaging with the field, with activists, with policymakers, you're actually allowing that to create your knowledge itself and make your knowledge kind of collaboratively. So this kind of aligns with feminist and post-structuralist ways of understanding knowledge production as inherently kind of relational and always already political and performative, like Gibbs and Graham also say. So for some, they express this as, again, sort of the way they saw their roles as academics, where they saw their role as kind of changing knowledge, changing discourse, and therefore changing and impacting, the social trajectories and social justice. And for some of them, this also meant actually kind of engaging with people who are not traditionally involved in academia, not traditionally able to make it in academia, and helping them kind of get into academia or have their voice heard in various ways. And lastly, from the kind of ontological perspective, so ontology being sort of understanding what or how the world itself actually is, the way you can sort of engage with this is challenging the dominant ontological paradigms. So it's based on the theoretical assumption that the way we engage with the world actually kind of makes the world. The world isn't something separate from what we're researching. So one respondent actually, the way they framed it was, it's partly how you frame things as an academic. There are certain theories that lend themselves more to have the politics taken out, or there's a certain type of political thinking that is really harmless. And I just found that really interesting quote. So it's also about the way that you actually see the ontological reality of the world. But it's worth bearing in mind that the people we spoke to mentioned a lot of risks, and this is particularly for the early career researchers, where they mentioned constantly taking risks by taking these tactics. So, and it's worth also stating, we spoke to people who kind of made it, more or less. There are people in positions, whether that's postdoc positions or professorships. And so, some of these people have said they've taken risks, but they're not taking the ultimate risk of being sacked, for example. And it's also worth bearing in mind that some of the people we spoke to mentioned that inherent kind of ethical dilemma of trying to resist the system from within it, and especially a system and institutions now that are in some cases charging like £9,000 a year for their undergrads, and that you, as being employed by one of these institutions, are benefiting from that, and the kind of ethical difficulties in that. But yeah, this part isn't meant as a sort of narrative of sort of the victim academic that sort of becomes heroic and then kind of subverts the system, but more that in a position of being within an institution as an academic, as a postdoc, as a PhD student, that you have specific opportunities that are kind of unique to that context to remake the world differently and change subjectivities potentially and change the ways that we work.
So the final thing that we wanted to talk about was this idea of positionality. And
we don't want to paint this presentation as any kind of generalized, homogenized picture of what it's like to be in academia. We did only speak to 6 people, and we do want to emphasize this is as much a personal project. We were almost seeking out older academics and mentors and asking them very personal questions, and this is just a small reflection of the conversations that we had. But we did notice that there were differences in different stories that came out, and they were very largely based in different identities, different backgrounds, different positions that these people held within their universities. One of the things we noticed is the people who spoke with younger academics in our group came out much more disenchanted and depressed about their future, the potential of their futures, than those of us like me who spoke with older academics who had succeeded. And one of the broader narratives that we got a sense of was that the younger academics found that the road ahead was going to be much more difficult. At the same time, a positive aspect of the story is that the older academics did mention positive things that had happened over time. One of the professors we spoke to, who's a mid-career academic and a full professor at Oxford, said, "I suspect that it was actually worse in the past to be female, to be young, to be black, to be left, to be gay." And so there is this kind of diversification within academia. Marginal faces and marginal identities are coming out. I'll be very quick, I apologize. But we also wanted to question what this diversification means. The kind of neoliberal sentimentality that we've been talking about frequently fetishizes multiculturalism and multicultural faces. But if it's superficial multiculturalism, what does that actually mean? If the marginal voices and the multicultural identities can't express marginal viewpoints, it's just their marginal identities that exist in academia. This undermines the very value of opening up academia to more non-traditional voices. And we did find that the more kind of quote-unquote marginal academics we spoke to did have difficulty speaking their mind, getting published, and being in a more privileged position. They had difficulty getting opportunities in their career, and they had to take risks. But at the same time, having a wider array of voices and faces in academia is valuable, and we can't deny that. We heard from some people who said, one of the people we spoke to said that she had had a lot of difficulty because of her radical politics getting positions and had been denied positions, but at the same time, she had found her people and was more or less thriving with finding a group of people that sympathized with her views. So it's kind of carving out a niche with like-minded people and building community within that niche. And the other thing is, even if your voice isn't privileged, even if you don't have the highest position, you are still in academia, you're still on the inside, and that is valuable in itself. That opens up opportunities and spaces where people can make a difference and do have some sort of agency. So I guess, just to quickly end in conclusion, when we were thinking about how we personally were going to navigate academia as young academics who wanted to be politically engaged, we thought the really important takeaways from the conversations we had were, one, about reflexivity, that it is important to be reflexive about your position, where you come from, how you view political engagement, whether you believe your work should be political, what political activism actually means. And we're conscious that we didn't define what political activism actually means because we wanted to leave it open. It's differently defined by different people. And at the same time, we have a responsibility. Like Anna said, we don't want to paint a victim narrative. We are in extremely privileged positions to be academics at, a good university, and we don't want to deny that. And we recognize that academics of our cohort do have a difficult road ahead, but we're also complicit within a system that disenfranchises other people, disenfranchises students that now have to pay, in some cases, £9,000 to be taught by us. One of the academics we spoke to called it like a gold rush, and academic as a bubble, and just as realtors during the housing bubble really had a lot of success in their careers, we as young academics are going to be making our income from the education bubble that's happening. And finally, we were reflecting on this idea of collaboration and collectivism, and maybe in the Q&A session or in the conversation tomorrow, we wanted to kind of open up the discussion and hear from other voices and how people felt their trajectories were going in academia and how they felt they were able or not able to express their political views, because we think collaboration is one of the most important forms of resistance and subverting these kinds of neoliberal paradigms that force us to be individual and isolated. And the conversations are very important. So, apologies for going over.
Thank you.